Recently, I've been fascinated with how some books can be so poorly received in their time and praised as top-tier literary masterpieces decades later, and how other books are so popular in their time but are relatively obscure now. Of course, a good example of the first kind is The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, which only really became widely acknowledged as a masterpiece about 20 years after its original publication, and is now a household name all over the world. Then for the second kind, there's Main Street by Sinclair Lewis, which doesn't seem to have quite the same name recognition or cultural importance now as contemporary novels such as The Great Gatsby, The Sun Also Rises, or All Quiet on the Western Front. But I, for one, think that it should. At the time of its publication in 1920, Main Street was a massive success. Within the first 6 months, around 180,000 copies were sold. Or, as the introduction of my edition stated, nearly every novel-reading American read it. It reached even beyond the normal book market, appearing on household shelves that bore only a handful of volumes besides the Bible. And in the context of the 1920s, this was a common theme for Sinclair Lewis. He was one of the very, very few authors who were able to be critically praised and write multiple big bestsellers. If you look at the list of the top 10 best-selling books of each year of the 1920s, you will be hard-pressed to find many recognizable names. Yet Lewis appears in these top 10 lists 5 times, meaning that 5 of his 7 novels published in that decade made the top 10. In terms of cultural impact and literature, this makes Sinclair Lewis perhaps the most important American writer of the 1920s. So now with some of the background facts out of the way, let's get into Main Street. First off, it's important to note that most of the book does not take place in the 1920s. It was only published at the very beginning of the decade, and the first half of the book takes place in the few years before the start of World War I, so the early 1910s. The main character of the novel is Carol, a young Minnesotan woman who just graduated from college and just started her job as a librarian in St. Paul, Minnesota. She soon meets an older doctor named Will Kennicott, and they get married. Mr. Kennicott is excited to be taking his new bride back to his small hometown of Gopher Prairie, Minnesota. At first, Carol feels the excitement of being newly married, but pretty quickly starts having reservations about living in a small town. She finds that she liked the excitement of the city and has mixed feelings about the denizens of Gopher Prairie. She annoys her new husband a bit by complaining about the town. Carol is a modern woman. She's intelligent, she loves literature, and she's a college graduate. And Gopher Prairie is not really a modern town in any sense. She feels the people there judging her, invading her privacy almost immediately. In one of her hectic internal thoughts, she imagines bearded, sniffy old men sitting and demanding that we bear children. If they had to bear them, I wish they did have to. If anyone watching this video is from a small town, you'll probably find the portrait that Lewis paints to be both funny and true. My favorite detail is that there's a man named Percy Bresnahan from Gopher Prairie, who became a successful businessman in the East. Carol is asked by one person if she knew that Percy Bresnahan was from Gopher Prairie. This was new information for her, so she learned it. But in the same day, she is asked the same question at least 2 more times. Anyone who has ever lived in a small town will know that if anyone from the town becomes a big shot in a city somewhere, no one in the town will shut up about it. At a get-together, a few citizens perform little skits and dances, and it's mentioned that Carol saw many of the same exact performances more than half a dozen more times just that winter, sometimes by the same person. This shows how virtually everyone in town is so easily entertained and complacent doing the same activities over and over. As far as reading materials in the town go, the highest class things mentioned had titles such as Mid the Magnolias and Riders of Ranch Reckless, which sound like something more akin to forgettable pulp fiction than anything of real literary value to Carol. She later talks to a man who says he tried to read a Balzac book, but it was too scandalous for him. Instead, this man finds movies better, because they're censored and not likely to have anything inappropriate. And that was a very timely thing to put into the novel, since very shortly after this book was released, there was a huge real-life debate about ramping up censorship in Hollywood. So in the whole town, there's only like 2 people who are interested in quote-unquote real literature. The townsfolk are also quite conservative. Mr. Kennicott gently warns his wife not to shock people by speaking of her stockings, ankles, or legs, and other immoral stuff. And these kind of comments continue for a while. The townspeople are also afraid of anything that so much as hints at socialism or communism, especially the all-feared farmers' communes. Carol also finds out that the women in town cannot freely use money, but have to get it from their husbands, who can refuse to give it at any time and for whatever reason. Carol found herself in this exact situation, and when she confronted her husband about it, he said he simply forgot, though the narration adds cheekily, and after that, he remembered to give her money regularly, sometimes. As more evidence for the townspeople's conservatism, one man also goes on a lengthy monologue that summarizes the political stance and general attitude of most of the men in town, and it goes like this. All this profit-sharing and welfare work and insurance and old age pension is simply poppycock, enfeebles a workman's independence, and wastes a lot of honest profit. The half-baked thinker that isn't dry behind the ears yet, and these suffragettes and God knows what all Batinskys there are that are trying to tell a businessman how to run his business, and some of these college professors are just about as bad. The whole kit and bile of them are nothing in God's world but socialism in disguise. And it's my bounden duty as a producer to resist every attack on the integrity of American industry to the last ditch. Yes, sir. Wow, does that sound familiar? I mean, without the use of poppycock. Even though this book was made 100 years ago, I think that attitude is still surprisingly accurate in many small towns even today. Was Lewis a soothsayer, or had he just figured out a somewhat universal trend? And here's just a fun little side note that I found interesting. It's mentioned that the people of Gopher Prairie say American instead of American. This appears to be the forerunner to the Murica that we all know and love today. So anyway, Carol hosts a big party, and despite quite a few signs to the contrary, thinks that she has improved her standing with everyone. She finds out from one of her closer acquaintances, a woman named Vita Sherwin, that in fact, what she had believed to be a generously large party offended some people by its lavishness, a challenge to anyone else to one-up her. Because her husband is a doctor, he makes more money than most others in town, and people thought she was showing off his wealth, which of course she hadn't intended. The townspeople look into everything Carol does and sees a deeper meaning that was never supposed to be there, like her party. It was also mentioned that one store owner was offended that Carol had bought furniture from the city instead of buying it in town. It's not directly stated, but it's not unreasonable to assume that the store owner might have thought that Carol thought the quality of the local furniture was worse. Carol also made the mistake of praising her servant, B. Sorensen, who along with the smaller class of Scandinavian servants is scorned by the other townspeople. B thinks of Main Street in the exact opposite way as Carol, regarding it as a beautiful place. Despite their differing views on that subject, the two of them get along very well. Their chumminess is also in spite of Carol's upbringing when she was taught to scorn the servant class. Carol also starts talking with Guy Pollock, a man described as a bit of a hermit. He's not especially close with many people in town, which is pretty rare there. But he is a learned man, something that Carol finds irresistibly attractive. Of course, she feels guilty about these feelings. He also tells her that all the doctors in town, implying that her husband is included, gyp people out of more money by making unnecessarily long house calls, which bothers Carol. A little less than halfway through the book, Carol and Will, her husband, have a big argument about their differing views of Gopher Prairie and the people there. In this long and heated argument, both of them have fair points. Carol criticizes the townspeople for failing to appreciate her effort despite the big challenge of adjusting to small-town life. Will calls Carol out on her high and mighty and too outwardly intellectual attitude towards many people, as well as her obvious disgust of certain habits, which he finds pretentious. Carol also brings up what Guy Pollock told her about the doctors, but doesn't name him. Will denies charging extra or gypping people out of more money, but says he does want to save more money for them to have a comfortable life together. They both soften, and by the end of the conversation, they have reached an understanding, and Carol is now sure that she loves him. We soon see, too, that Will was telling the truth about not being greedy for money, when he couldn't care less that one woman couldn't pay him at the moment for a late-night house call and assured her that it was fine. Carol tries to get some sophistication into the town with the establishment of a theater association. After a lengthy debate on which play to do, Carol does not like any of the other suggestions, but is outvoted. Most of the townspeople don't take the rehearsals too seriously, and upon opening night, Carol is mortified at the performance as a whole. The audience didn't see it quite so negatively. Most enjoyed it, though as one remarked, they would rather have seen a movie with auto chases and less talking than a play. Every ticket was sold, the audience was relatively satisfied, the local newspaper gave a positive review, but Carol was very disappointed, and the actors didn't seem interested in putting on another play anytime soon. Throughout the novel, Carol seems to fall in and out of favor with the townspeople. When her son, Hugh, is born, some of Kennicott's relatives, Aunt Bessie and Uncle Whittier, drop in unexpectedly and stay with them. They annoy Carol to no end with their constant pestering. They're like many of the others in town, except they're in constant close proximity and extra nosy. And they're horrified when Carol says she doesn't want to have Hugh christened. Of course, Carol is not very religious, something which immediately makes her suspicious to the others. Around this time, we also get to hear some of the townspeople's silly arguments. My favorite one was when one man complained about another man because he said that the wind was blowing south the previous Tuesday when in fact it had been blowing southwest. Then the novel switches over to Vida Sherwin's perspective, and we learn of her backstory. It turns out that Kennicott had aggressively flirted with her some years before he had met Carol. Vida had firmly rejected his advances. It seems that he flirted with a lot of women back then. But when he came back to Gopher Prairie with Carol, a city girl who was much younger than him, Vida, still unmarried herself, became very jealous, despite Carol's shared interest in literature. But then Vida falls in love with a local man named Ramey Wutherspoon, and they get married fairly quickly. Vida's confidence improves, but she still has some jealousy toward Carol and Kennicott, partly because Kennicott has a higher status in town than Mr. Wutherspoon. Of the citizens of Gopher Prairie and other small towns, Carol thinks that they are, quote, a savorless people, gulping tasteless food, and sitting afterward, coatless and thoughtless, in rocking chairs, prickly with inane decorations, listening to mechanical music, saying mechanical things about the excellence of Ford automobiles, and viewing themselves as the greatest race in the world. And also that, quote, the respectability of the Gopher Prairies is reinforced by vows of poverty and chastity in the matter of knowledge. Except for half a dozen in each town, the citizens are proud of that achievement of ignorance, which is so easy to come by. To be intellectual or artistic, in their own word, to be highbrow, is to be priggish and of dubious virtue. Carol and Vida have a bit of a falling out. Vida confronts Carol about her desire to reform the town, but having made virtually no progress. Meanwhile, other people in town have won some victories, small ones, but more than Carol has done. The antithesis to the values of Gopher Prairie comes in the form of Miles Bjornstam. At the beginning of the novel, Miles is a bit of a contract worker, not having any desire to tie himself down with a real job in a town that he hates. He is agnostic and has socialist tendencies, completely at odds with the town's deep religiousness and complete aversion to anything socialist. Later on, Miles marries Bee, Carol's former housekeeper. Miles then becomes motivated to be successful in his own modest way, and starts up a dairy farm. Then they have a son named Olaf, and they are a happy, healthy family, though not very well off financially. But they are isolated from the others in town, who generally avoid them like the plague, except Carol, who not only visits but also brings her son Hugh to play with Olaf. She does, however, feel a bit self-conscious of her association with them at one point. But both Bee and Olaf die tragically from typhoid, and Miles leaves town, and he would have been run out by the townspeople anyway if he had tried to stay. Even with this tragedy, they would not forgive his ideologies. Then comes the Fern Mullins incident. Fern is a new teacher, fresh from college, and still very naive. One of her students is a boy, only about 2 years younger than her, that is well known in town as a troublemaker and is always drinking alcohol. One night, Fern Mullins accepts the boy's invitation to a dance. The boy gets drunk, and his mother, a religious fanatic, believes that Fern is a temptress out to get her son. The mother bawls out Miss Mullins and reports her to the school board to get her fired. The young teacher confides in Carol, telling her that she only accepted the invitation so she could dance, and didn't even spend much of the time with that boy. He had gotten drunk on whiskey and persuaded her to take a sip, which she did. 1 sip. The boy's mother, completely oblivious to her son's reckless and troublesome behavior, believes that Fern was to blame for all of this. We, as the reader, have no reason to disbelieve Fern Mullins, and every reason not to believe Mrs. Bogart, the mother. That's how Lewis sets it up. And here comes his biggest denunciation of small towns. Carol makes it her duty to get Fern Mullins out of trouble by talking with those who have influence on the outcome of the case. While everyone seems to believe that the incident isn't so bad, Mrs. Bogart is an influential member of the community, especially because she is the most involved in the church and has close connections with enough people on the school board to side with her. Carol begs them to plead Miss Mullins' case. She knows, and says so, that not only will this terminate the young teacher's job in Gopher Prairie, but will affect future employment too, because it will be on record. Her career would be ruined before it barely even begun. Everyone knows that Mrs. Bogart's son is a hellion, and they sympathize with her plight, which was caused by inexperience and naivety, yet no one will even attempt to help her. They don't want to disrupt the social order by saying that Mrs. Bogart was mistaken. What ends up happening is that Fern Mullins is forced to resign instead of being fired, which essentially changes nothing, and she has to leave town just like Miles before her. Carol receives a letter later on from Miss Mullins, and she says that she can't find a teaching job anywhere because of that mark on her record, and that she may just marry a man who loves her just to have stability. Shortly after Miles leaves, in comes Eric Valborg, a young farmer's boy about 20 years old. He is a lover of poetry and the arts, despite not being able to pronounce the difficult words he wants to use. His appearance in the novel overlaps a bit with the Fern Mullins fiasco, but reaches a head after she leaves town. Carol is torn because she's not sure if she's falling in love with Eric or not. She's certainly getting further away from her husband, Kennicott, since they don't seem to talk much anymore, at least not in a positive manner. As Carol and Eric get closer, people in town start to notice how close they've become, and how they often venture alone together, and start gossiping about it. This culminates in Kennicott driving up to them as they are alone, all but making them get in the car without directly saying so. He drops off Eric, and then he and Carol have an argument. In this argument, Kennicott makes some fair points. He says, what has he actually done in the art line? Has he done one first-class picture, or sketch, do you call it? Or one poem, or played the piano, or anything except gas about what he's going to do? He also understands how the town works, and that the social flack will hit Carol and him, and everyone will talk about their private lives. He trusts that Carol won't betray him, but any lingering feelings will be picked up on by the town. Carol has an epiphany moment and knows that she must break off any relationship with Eric, who also leaves town. This marks a renewal of her love for Kennicott yet again. One theme in the novel is the village virus, a term introduced by Guy Pollock when Carol meets with him in his office for the first time. This is when someone with ambition moves to a small town such as Gopher Prairie, and it drains their ambitions and aspirations from them. And this is foreshadowing for Carol's experience there. After spending nearly half of the novel trying to change the town and make reforms, Carol just stops. Her attraction to Eric's relatively surface-level understanding of poetry and art was kind of the last vestige of that part of her, and then he left. Gopher Prairie starts to show promise for the future in the form of factories and the like. Ironically, Carol does not like the man who has come into town to lead the charge. After having been somewhat calm about her ideas of reform and progressiveness, she and Kennicott suddenly burst into an argument. He calls her seditious for having sympathy for some German farmers who are assumed, but not proven, to be pro-German in terms of the ongoing war. Carol brings up her dissatisfaction with Gopher Prairie and her role in life in general. This reaches a climax when she says, "Was I more happy when I was drudging? I was not. I was just bedraggled and unhappy. It's work, but not my work. I could run an office or a library, or nurse and teach children. But solitary dishwashing isn't enough to satisfy me, or many other women. We're going to chuck it. We're going to wash 'em by machinery, and come out and play with you men in the offices and clubs and politics you've cleverly kept for yourselves. Oh, we're hopeless, we dissatisfied women." Their relationship sours again, but this time Carol decides to take her son, Hugh, and move to Washington, D.C. for the time being, where she would stay for almost 2 years. There she had a boring but not awful job, very similar to the one she had at the library at the beginning of the novel. She mingles with people of national importance, senators, financiers, industrialists. She also finds out that Gopher Prairie's chosen son, Percy Bresnahan, is not taken very seriously in the real big time. It seems like her experience in Washington is what Carol had wanted all along. But when looking back at Gopher Prairie and Kennicott, her negative passion has faded away, replaced by a warm nostalgia. One passage of Carol's thoughts shows us Lewis's commentary on how small towns become idealized in people's minds. "I've been making the town a myth. This is how people keep up the tradition of the perfect hometown, the happy boyhood, the brilliant college friends. We forget so. I've been forgetting that Main Street doesn't think it's in the least lonely and pitiful. It thinks it's God's own country. It isn't waiting for me. It doesn't care. And Carol even starts to think of Gopher Prairie as her home. She is affected when Kennicott comes to visit her, their marital status still uncertain to both of them. His visit especially convinces her to return to the town after a few more months in the city. It's very ironic that she only learns to appreciate Gopher Prairie after finally achieving her dream of living in a cultured, sophisticated place. In the last few pages of the book, we find out that Carol had another child, a girl this time, and that Carol has more or less assimilated into the town. She finally chooses to see a movie over reading a book, and starts calling the other women by their first names rather than more formally and distant by using only their last names. And this is how the novel ends, with a short speech by Carol, who says, "But I have won in this. I've never excused my failures by sneering at my aspirations, by pretending to have gone beyond them. I do not admit that Main Street is as beautiful as it should be. I do not admit that Gopher Prairie is greater or more generous than Europe. I do not admit that dishwashing is enough to satisfy all women. I may not have fought the good fight, but I have kept the faith." To this, Kennicott responds, "Sure, you bet you have. Well, good night. Sort of feels to me like it might snow tomorrow. Have to be thinking about putting up the storm windows pretty soon. Say, did you notice whether the girl put that screwdriver back?" So basically, he once again ignores her principles. While we do sometimes sympathize with Kennicott and get frustrated with Carol, he never really tries to see things from Carol's perspective. He just seems to be waiting for her to see things his way, Gopher Prairie's way. And this ending shows that even after Carol was finally convinced that Gopher Prairie was a good place, she still has these ideals somewhere inside of her. And Kennicott, despite his traumatic experience of nearly losing Carol for good, still doesn't see eye to eye with her. And to me, it can be interpreted as kind of a sad ending. Perhaps Carol has accepted her fate, and will try to just take it at face value, retaining her ideals but unable to do anything with them in such a conservative, unchanging town, and had succumbed to the village virus. Main Street is also interesting in its historical context. Before World War I, small towns were generally looked at with warmth, reverence, and nostalgia, and they were associated with close community ties that were seen as a great feature. But after the war, the more cynical view of small towns was popularized by Lewis. The close community ties turned into nosy people with apparently nothing better to do than snoop on others, and the small town turned from nostalgic to old-fashioned and too conservative. I'm honestly very disappointed that Main Street isn't in the public consciousness at all today. It's very similar to An American Tragedy in that people in the literary sphere recognize how good it is, but almost everyone outside of that has probably never even heard of it. Main Street, An American Tragedy, and The Great Gatsby all have pretty universal themes that could still easily be applied today. But I guess most people are less interested in social criticisms about small towns and more interested in big lavish parties. Those are just the breaks. So those were my random thoughts on Main Street. Overall, I would definitely recommend it. The social commentary is very interesting, and quite a few points about small towns are quite relevant even today. And since it was one of the most popular novels of the 1920s, it's great to have a book that is so well written and entertaining, but also critically acclaimed. I also want to mention that Main Street was made into a Hollywood movie in 1923, but just like The Great Gatsby film, it is currently lost. I'm planning on covering it in one of my Lost Films videos in the future, so keep an eye out for that. Well, that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.